All right, hello everybody. This is Antonio Wolf. Going to be doing a little reading and critique here. And before we do that, I hate saying this, but it works apparently. Hit that like button, and maybe send it to Wolfendale. This is an article by Peter Wolfendale. There's a book he came out with recently in which this article is one of the articles in it. Probably updated a little bit, but from what I'm aware of, it's not significantly different. It's a critique of Hegel, and I actually had responded to this quite a while ago. And in probably around 2017. Where was it? Justification method. When was this? When did I publish this? Yeah, 2017. But I saw this mentioned in a podcast by some disciples of Todd McGowan, in which they read it, and since they're not very good Hegel scholars or Marxists, they didn't really know what to make of this. Besides, well, we kind of sort of think that he's not quite right, but what do we know? And then they invited Peter Wolfendale on for like a 4-hour interview, which honestly, like, probably only about an hour that I found interesting. And they particularly questioned him about this a little bit, but they didn't really get into it. So, I mean, all that comes out of it as well. Wolfendale's obviously not a Hegelian. You can tell that from this. But the criticism in this is, if you don't know what Hegel's about, it seems like there's something there. If you know what Hegel's about, you realize there's nothing there. So we shall just read this. Hold on, let me pull up my window here. So, can you guys see the stream? Rain, Tree Man, other people?
Yes.
Okay. So, The Greatest Mistake, A Case for the Failure of Hegel's Idealism by Peter Wolfendale. What is a great mistake? Nietzsche once said that a great error is worth more than a multitude of trivial truths. A truly great mistake is one that we can learn from, where we gain new understanding from explaining why it is an error, where we are forced to make explicit our previously vague intuitions or forced to acknowledge properly counterintuitive results. Hegel understood this point well, as his analysis of the logical and historical development of human thought shows, for he takes each moment within this development to be a position that, while showing itself to be inconsistent, passes over into a more detailed position that incorporates its truth. Yep, incorporation. It is my opinion that Hegel may have made the greatest such error in the history of philosophy to date. And this means that understanding why it is an error is of the utmost importance. To do this, it is necessary to examine the nature of Hegel's position, which he calls absolute idealism. What is absolute idealism? The essence of absolute idealism is the thesis of the identity of subject and object. This is only partially true. So, as you can see, I already had prior notes on this, so I'm just going to read you my notes. So this is only partially true. It is truer to say that it is the thesis that there is one reality which is subject and object to itself, distinguishes itself within itself in the idealization of itself, and is the relation of itself as the idealization of the whole and itself as the idealization of the part, and is thus their mutual reflexive upheaval Aufhebung, or what you normies call sublation, as the idealization of idealization, hence the absolute idea. So the way he's framing it here is reductive in my view. It's not just that subject and object are united, because if that was the definition of absolute idealism, which it is part of it, then Hegel would have counted Schelling and Fichte as absolute idealists, but he doesn't. So, the essence of absolute idealism is the thesis of the identity of subject and object, which we'll simply call the identity thesis. It's very important to understand what this doesn't mean. It is not to be understood along the lines of the maxim of Berkeley's subjective idealism, esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived, which, by the way, is not entirely wrong. Now, like, Berkeley, I don't know about Berkeley because I haven't read Berkeley, and I'm going to be honest, I'm not going to read Berkeley. But if experience tells me anything, is that if somebody is shat upon who's not read much, like Berkeley, just like Hegel, chances are that what people shit upon is probably not what they actually believed. And so I'm willing to leave it open that Berkeley is not as stupid as the typical caricatures portray. But this idea that to be is to be perceived, if you link it only to consciousness, yes, it's trivially untrue. But if you link it to perception as knowledge, and you don't reduce knowledge to what representations a consciousness has, then Hegel's logic basically proves that to be is to be perceived, for to be is to be known, and to be known is to be cognized by the absolute idea, and what the absolute idea cognizes is its own cognition. And so all things that are true are nothing but self-cognitions, and so just as an object is in its independence as resisting and objecting other things by enclosing itself as a substance, likewise, one could say that on the subjective side of the concept of the thing, it is so objectively in that it is a concept that conceives itself. So to be is to be perceived, for to be is to be thought, to be known, to be cognized. So this is only superficially false, let's say. Any thoughts on that, Rain?
One of my first thoughts is I suspect that an enormous amount of confusion about issues like this partly derives from how unstudied, unread, or otherwise ignored Hegel's philosophy of nature is. Because usually when people take issue with, say, like this absolute cognition account you kind of provided in brief, there is a sort of presupposition about what nature is or what independent things are or have to be. And I think Hegel's philosophy of nature demonstrates how it's like nature is impossible without spirit. And I like your point about the reduction of knowledge to mere perception. Like for Hegel, it doesn't follow like that. Just you like only things like say in your field of view or something are there. It's like no, like inferentially, because of what nature is, there's necessarily more further that you're not looking at and so forth. But that's not a problem. In fact, it's a consequence of the sort of nature of this absolute cognition as well. So there's just like, I think that unfamiliarity with Hegel's philosophy of nature is placed in the system, and its connection to logic and to spirit is responsible for a lot of confusions.
Yeah. So continuing, it is not the case for Hegel that each individual object is identical with an individual subject that thinks it or some state of that subject, which again, going back to the self-thinking of things, well, if a thing is actually an object, it must be a subject as well, and so it is a subject that thinks itself. It is an object precisely because it thinks itself. So that's not quite true either. So instead, the thesis can be interpreted in three different ways. This is indicated by the fact that there are three distinct formulations of it: as the unity of subject and object, as the unity of thought and being, and as the unity of subject and substance. Respectively, these correspond to idealism as method, absolute knowing, idealism as system, absolute idea, and idealism as reality, absolute spirit. So, I mean, this is an external reflection of his. He's setting up this set of relationships, which, I mean, subject-object, that's what's there. Thought and being, it's kind of there. Subject and substance, that's really just a repetition of subject and object. It's not actually different. He's made it different as being, a real. He's made it a form of the thought-being distinction, but it actually really isn't. And he's going to map this onto Kant later, but so I can see why he tries to structure it this way, but I don't think it works. All right. Absolute idea names the identity of the general structures of subject and objects, which are named thought and being, respectively. Now, this is equivocation on his part. He knows it. He knows that when Hegel talks about being, he's not talking about what he means as reality. Like, the everyday sense of reality, like that distinction. But here he's making it as like, oh, well, it's the general structures of subjects and objects which are named thought and being, respectively, but they're not. Absolute spirit names the identity of subject and substance, or absolute idea as instantiated in a singular structure, which is the correlate of both the Aristotelian and the Spinozan conceptions of God. This lets us explain precisely why Heidegger takes Hegel's thought to represent the ultimate form of what he called ontotheology. Absolute idea is a structure of beings as such, and it is a form of beingness, insofar as it thinks being as a genus. Absolute spirit is a structure of beings as a whole, or world, insofar as it is the immanent ground of their existence in the self-externalization of absolute idea. So these are external reflections again, especially Heidegger's thing, the ontotheology thing. One, I mean, Hegel would have no issues with ontotheology, like, being and God are the same thing. Not because they're identical concepts, but because what is intended by the reference is the same thing. Hegel does not hold that being is even a genus, by the way. So he says, well, Hegel holds being as a genus. Well, no, being is not a genus. Being is not a species either. Being is just the most immediate thought determination in the system of logic. That's it. Absolute spirit is the structure of beings as a whole, or world, insofar as it is the immanent ground of their existence in the self-externalization of absolute idea. Hegel thus thinks what Heidegger calls a being, the unified structure of beings as such and as a whole, in terms of beings themselves, namely in terms of subjects in general and a highest subject respectively. Again, like there's problems with that because the idea is not just the being of beings, and it is not just a general being. It is itself a being within itself. Like the idea both refers to the world as a whole, or God as a whole, as you want to call it, and it also refers to the fact that we are right now in cognition grasping the totality of the metaphysical relationships of that whole within itself entirely. So it's not just like, well, there's a bunch of beings, and here's the highest subject. It's also a finite thing within its own infinity. It's not that simple as he wants to paint it. It's not that kind of division. So it doesn't suffer, because Heidegger's whole thing is like, well, everybody treats being as a being. They don't realize that it's just the being of beings, which itself not a being. Well, the idea is not just a being, nor is it just being. And you can't say that the idea is the qualification of being, because the idea is what Hegel means by what Heidegger references as being is what Hegel means as the idea. So like here, like he's equivocating. Like being does not refer to the same thing.
I think perhaps the red outlining is a bad choice. Or the red highlighting.
That's just like me. When I was going through this, I was just setting that up for a quick visual reference of like the stuff that I really disagreed with.
Okay. Maybe a different color would be better. Yeah.
Looks fun on my screen. Anyways, I'm reading it out loud. So this explicitly violates Heidegger's principle of the ontological difference. Well, Hegel isn't Heidegger. Heidegger isn't the god of reality, so who cares what Heidegger decrees as a principle? However, I'm principally interested in the identity thesis in its form as method, as absolute knowing, or what Hegel will call the concept of science, and the role it plays in Hegel's attempt to elaborate idealism as system, or to describe the structure of the absolute idea. This is the project of his masterwork, The Science of Logic. If the identity thesis provides the form of absolute idealism, then the science of logic unpacks its content. Specifically, I'm interested in the way that the identity thesis functions as a presupposition of logic. And so, you hear about presuppositions. You know that triggers anybody who likes Hegel. So, I mean, Hegel himself says, look, the logic does not have presuppositions, all right? So...
What are you talking about? Everyone has presuppositions.
Well, you presuppose that. So, because the logic does not presuppose thought or being to be at all from the beginning, and thus can neither presuppose their difference nor identity before deriving them, thought is not opposed to object. Okay. Sorry, I'm reading the comment that I wrote. So in regards to this, the identity thesis functions as a presupposition of logic. No. Why? Because the logic does not presuppose thought or being to be at all from the beginning, and thus can neither presuppose their difference nor identity before deriving them. So there can neither be an identity thesis nor can there be a denial of their identity, like the thesis of their difference. Neither of those is at the beginning. Thought is not opposed to object within the system, but thought appears as what Hegel calls cognition, and its opposition is not to objectivity, its opposition is to life. And these are both ideas. They are already like beyond subject-object. Like they are already upheavals, sublations, Aufhebung. For those of you listening, I translate Aufhebung as upheaval. People usually translate it as sublation. I got reasons. You want to find out, look at my blog. Just mention that when you hear upheaval, think both, overthrow, but also think heaving up. And in that, think uplifting. So, continuing specifically, I'm interested in the way that the identity thesis functions as a presupposition of the logic and how this relates to Hegel's famous claim that the logic is presuppositionless. This claim is true in a limited fashion insofar as the identity thesis does not function as a premise in the argument that makes up the logic. However, we can distinguish two distinct senses in which it functions as a methodological presupposition, as determining the procedure which the argument follows, and as determining the way in which the results of the argument should be interpreted. So I'll go ahead and say it doesn't determine in any way, neither as a methodological position of procedure nor as an interpretation, because you're just, if you don't have the distinction, then like you're just not really bothering with it. To explain this, it's necessary to say a little bit about the logic. I'm going to presume a little bit of familiarity with the work, and as I'll focus on the structure of the argument rather than its content. The crucial point is that the argument is stratified. To show this, I will distinguish at least 4 separate levels at which it operates. The basic dialectic. This is the logic viewed as a serial progression of various categories, starting with the category of being, transitioning through nothing, becoming, and the various other categories up to the final category of absolute idea. The division of books. This is the threefold separation of the logic into the doctrine of being, essence, concept, which each display a distinctive internal structure which differentiates them from the others. The division of volumes. This is the twofold separation of the logic into the objective logic, which includes both being and essence, and the subjective logic, which includes the concept. The overall dialectic. This is the logic viewed as the complete explication of the implicit content of the concept of being in its systematic form as absolute idea, which contains the totality of the previous moments of the logic and their relations. This is to view the argument as a whole as a single inference or the self-overcoming of the concept of being. There are various intermediary levels here that we won't go into. The important point is that the transitions between categories at the lower levels essentially make explicit the content of the categories at the higher levels. On this basis, we can see that the identity thesis does not form an explicit premise at any point of the argument, but is ultimately derived by the complete transition from being to absolute idea, which demonstrates the identity of object and subject, or being and thought. So this is kind of true as an external reflection, but it's actually not true, because nowhere really does Hegel ever stop and say, and now here we have, here's the derivation of the concept of thought, and here's the derivation of the concept of objects as the other of thought, and here we have their identity. It's just the difference is never presupposed, and so the identity never has to be proven. If you externally impose it, it can be shown that it collapses to what he's doing, where they are internally related. But if you just don't make the distinction, neither a difference nor an identity is really to be made. However, this is not a justification of the identity thesis, but merely its transition from an implicit condition to an explicit principle of the system itself. To take it as a justification would be to fall into a vicious circle, as Hegel himself understood all too well. So we can see here, the big issue is going to say, look, even though it doesn't play, the identity thesis does not play an explicit role within the argument, it is implicitly being assumed, and it has not been justified. Now, both of those are actually false. One, because again, by not assuming the distinction, there has to be no justification for the identity. If there was no identity, then the thing would fall apart on its own. It's that simple. Just like in the Phenomenology spirit, we do not assume their identity. Therefore, even though, yes, it is an assumption to take them as different, the difference itself shows its collapse. So if they weren't identical, it would also show their separation. So there's no point in trying to prove it one way or the other at the beginning. Second, as far as justification goes, he has a very strict view of what justification means, because I suppose because justification for me is just being able to give a reason for why you're doing things, and Hegel does nothing but that, so everything's justified and given justification. But if what you mean by justification is giving a formal logical argument with P's and Q's that follows very particular metaphysical restrictions, the law of sufficient reason as an ontological thing, for example, then Hegel could not make a justification. But that view of justification is itself unjustified. So we can now characterize the two functions of the identity thesis as implicit methodological presuppositions of the system in more detail. So again, they're not presuppositions, actually. In its function as a deductive procedure, it determines the dialectical structure of the logic. It constitutes a non-intentional form of thought in which we do not use pre-individuated concepts to form fixed propositions about particular objects, but instead think the content of concepts directly, allowing them to imminently transform themselves into other concepts by way of what Hegel calls speculative propositions. I don't know why he's focusing on propositions here, because read Hegel, propositions aren't really how he works. He mentions them a few times, that's about it. The logic uses this method in order to carry out an imminent deduction of the structure of thought itself by beginning with the most minimal content that can be thought, indeterminate immediacy, which is named being insofar as it is the one concept that applies to all objects, or as Heidegger correctly notes, the highest genus of beings. That's not actually the reason. He himself already gave it. Like, the actual reason is that being just is what everything is. Thoughts are, being is. Thoughts are, reality is, nature is, physics is, imagination is, anything, possibilities are, everything and anything is. But the is not a qualification upon them. It is just the immediacy of itself, the immediate determination. So being is not chosen because it applies to everything or because it is the highest genus. Hegel explicitly denies this in the comments, the remarks in chapter 1. The procedure of the logic is then to systematically explicate what is explicit, what is implicit in this content, and thus the structure of conceptual thought as such. The result of this is that the logic does not start with a complete method, but systematically explicates its own process of explication as it goes. True. In its function as interpretational schema, it determines a system produced as both a logic and a metaphysics. The identity thesis guarantees that an imminent deduction of the logical categories of thought is simultaneously an imminent deduction of the metaphysics, the metaphysical categories of being. The schema is made explicit within the subjective logic, where the category of being becomes explicit as a concept. And the transition to absolute idea makes explicit the identity of being with its concept. Actually, no, being is not a concept, properly speaking. Becoming is the concept of which being and not are merely abstractions. So my comment on that is that when he says being with its concept, again, this is a sleight of hand equivocation. Volume 1 is called the objective logic, Volume 2 the subjective logic. Wolfendale knows well that Hegel's being is not the being he's defining in opposition to thought. Being is revealed to have implicitly operated under object, but it's not itself directly object, and the object in question is not the object against thought. So, it's an object with a K. It's not a Gegenstand or an objectant, as I call it. An object merely in its opposition to consciousness. So this is the point at which the logic is determined as theology, insofar as it is here that the externalization of absolute idea in its form of absolute spirit is demonstrated. I'm not sure what he's going on about there. I mean, it follows his schema, but I don't really see the necessary connection. On this basis, we can see that in order for the logic to be justified in both the form of its reasoning and the content of its conclusions, then the identity thesis must be independently validated. Now, that's ridiculous. I mean, you know anything about Hegel, you know that it's supposed to be the science of logic, and the idea is supposed to be self-validating reason. To then say, well, look, there's this problem in that you didn't assume, because it's not a positive assumption, it's that he's not making a negative assumption. So in that Hegel didn't assume another assumption, there must therefore be a justification for not assuming an assumption. But that itself assumes something when the whole point is not to assume anything. And then to ask, well, there must be an independent external validation to the non-assumption, because I am going to say that it is an assumption, is itself assumptive, which defeats the whole purpose.
This is brutal. He might as well just keep chanting ontological difference, ontological difference, he's not demonstrating anything. He just keeps reasserting ontological difference. So it's like he didn't even read it, or he's just taking maybe Heidegger's interpretation for granted as well as Heidegger's principle. This is just brutal.
Yeah. So let me read my notes. So, as the logic is the independence of thought that originates the categories of subject, object, and syllogistic inferences that form justification to begin with, the idea of an external validation of a thesis is utter nonsense. Wolfendale is saying that there must be a justification for justification, but the subjective logic already begins as a refutation of the logic of external grounds and conditions. Literally, the second volume, the subjective logic, begins the concept with the direct refutation in the last chapter of volume 2 of Essence, where this whole idea of foundations and grounds, which the logic of sufficient reason as a metaphysical principle is a form of, and just shows you that this cannot function, that whatever reasoning and justification really is, it cannot be foundational. So to ask for an external validation for something is completely irrational at that point. So continuing. If the science of logic corresponds to Kant's metaphysical deduction of the categories, and the phenomenology of spirit corresponds to the transcendental deduction of their validity. So here's my comment on that. So this analogy doesn't hold. Neither the logic nor phenomenology are deductions in the Kantian sense, or any regular sense really. Neither of them are limited to metaphysical or epistemic concerns. Both operate in onto-epistemic unity, where the concepts of things are also the measure of their epistemic axis and justification. So the phenomenology has no determining bearing on the logic. Hegel himself denies this, and his logic proves this. It is a negative proof of the impotence, the phenomenology is a negative proof of the impotence of natural consciousness to know anything but its own knowing, and leaves only the immediate abstraction of this empty knowing, which is the beginning of the logic being. Continuing, why is Hegel an absolute idealist? The argument of the phenomenology is motivated by responding both to skepticism and the transcendental response to skepticism. The transcendental response, which is exemplified by Kant's response to Humean skepticism, promises to show that knowledge is possible by analyzing the structure of knowledge in the form of the conditions of the possibility of knowledge. For Hegel, this begs the question insofar as it presupposes some kind of knowledge about knowledge that itself is unsecured. I'm going to call this the problem of transcendental method. Hegel tries to sidestep this problem and thereby secure a form of unconditioned or absolute knowledge by returning to the most extreme form of skepticism, Pyrrhonian skepticism. The problem posed by Pyrrhonian skepticism can be described in two ways. It is originally posed by Sextus Empiricus as the problem of the criterion, which asks how we can find a criterion for choosing between a proposition and its negation that does not itself require a criterion to be justified. However, its most clear formulation is Agrippa's trilemma, which asks how it is possible to justify any proposition in contrast to its negation without either A, merely asserting its truth, bare assertion, B, appealing to another proposition that itself must be justified, regress, or C, justifying it by appeal to itself, circularity. I disagree that Agrippa's trilemma is actually clear. The dilemma of the criterion is actually far clearer as to what the problem of skepticism is, in which all of these A, asserting its truth, that's just a non-rational. That's the same thing as C, which is appeal to itself. It's just A is just a flat identity, and C is just you can mediate the whole thing back to an appeal to itself, but it's still the same collapse. So you still only have really two options. It's either you just assert the thing, or you have a regress of the thing. And the mere assertion provides no reason, so it's irrational, and then the attempt to provide further reasons, the regress, just leads to an infinite chain because there's no way to establish foundational validity. Hegel uses this to clarify the problem of transcendental method. He takes that in trying to describe the structure conceived as conditions of possibility, the transcendental philosopher implicitly assumes that knowledge is possible, and this is precisely what the Pyrrhonian skeptic denies. So my comment on this, the possibility of knowledge is not a question for the skeptic, for they do not make claims on possibility, but on claims on actual knowledge. only claims on actual knowledge. Whether knowledge is possible, they do not know, but they can check all actual claims to know, be it claims about the possibility or impossibility of knowledge. So I just think that he's mischaracterizing the skeptic there. Hegel's response is then to describe the structure of knowledge as it appears, thereby bracketing the question of whether this structure actually makes knowledge possible. My comment, so I consider this to be Wolfendale's prediction. Hegel has no possibility in mind, but the dogmatism of having the criterion of one's own that requires justification. The phenomenologist has no criterion but what others offer. The phenomenologist of knowledge sets out merely to observe and test the knowledge claims of others as they themselves set them, not as the phenomenologist externally frames and judges them to achieve knowledge. This is the virtue of the position. It's basically the skeptical position. This is what the skeptics claim that they do. The skeptic says, we have no claim on knowledge. You claim to have knowledge. We just demand that you prove it. But the skeptic does have a claim on knowledge because they have a claim on the procedures for validating knowledge, which is the criterion problem. And Hegel doesn't do that. Hegel does not set up the criterion problem at all. He says, okay, here are claims of knowledge. Let's just see, do they achieve what they claim in the way that they claim it? The crucial insight that enables him to do this is that the Pyrrhonian skeptic must explicitly pose the problem of the criterion, and that this involves describing the structure of justification in order to show its impossibility. In essence, if the skeptic is permitted to describe the apparent structure of knowledge in order to undermine it, then so is Hegel. He does this by providing what he calls the concept of natural consciousness. So my comment on that is this is not true in the way Wolfendale claims. Skeptics do not describe the apparent structure of knowledge. They describe it as it is apparent to them in a universal projection. This is why they demand that others defeat their dilemma to begin with. So if they were merely describing the apparent structure of knowledge, they would just take other people's criterions as they give them. But that's not what the skeptic does. The skeptic has their own criterion already for what will count as the procedure for validating knowledge. So Hegel does not do that, for he describes the appearance of knowledge as it shows itself to the claimants of that knowledge according to their own criterion of the object they claim to know. Hegel does not ask if they can beat a dilemma or trilemma, but simply what is consequent of their endeavor to know. Continuing, before explaining the structure of natural consciousness, it's important to understand the role it is supposed to play in his justification of the identity thesis. So again, in that framing, one can call it, the phenomenology, a justification of an identity thesis. But again, it's a negative justification by just not assuming it. In the logic, at least. And in the phenomenology, it's a negative justification by having actually shown that it just doesn't work. That it undermines itself, it's unintelligible. The crucial point is that the concept of natural consciousness is the concept of the non-identity of subject and object. The phenomenology justifies the logic by showing how our ordinary understanding of knowledge, or knowledge as it appears to us, contradicts itself and thus transforms itself into its negation or the standpoint of science. It thus shows how knowledge as it is ordinarily understood is indeed impossible. However, insofar as the argument of Pyrrhonian skepticism is dependent upon this ordinary understanding, it is also a refutation of skepticism. So my comment on that is, not quite. Skepticism is not grounded in the subject-object divide as concerns knowers, but on the divide internal to rational justification, in which explication can only be intelligible with reference to an other than what it is, and other than what is to be explained. While skepticism is undergirded by the assumption of sufficient reason, its main bulwark is in the denial of the validity of circularity. Hegel's absolute knowing not only Not only is there an undermining of the knower-known divide, it is also a thorough positive proof that circular accounts are intelligible, since the entire process moves in these circles of dialectic from the beginning. To put it short, Wolfendale says that the Pyrrhonian skeptic is dependent upon this ordinary understanding of the subject-object divide, and I think skepticism is actually broader than that. Even if you had no such divide, there would still be a skeptical problem. So this justifies the characterization of the science as absolute knowing. I'll now turn to describing the structure of natural consciousness in its opposition to science. Hegel's definition is extraordinarily simple. It has two basic features. One, consciousness relates itself to its object or takes its object to be a certain way. What this means is that it expresses a proposition about its object. Again, I don't know why he brings this proposition shit up. Read it yourself. Read the Phenomenology Spirit. Sense certainty has no proposition. It doesn't even speak in sentences. It's just like this, here, now. Single words, single concepts. Perception is the only one that I remember dealing somewhat in propositions. But even then, the main focus is actually on the concepts in the propositions. The also, the unity, the plurality, the matters. It's not really on this propositional claim at all. So, two, consciousness distinguishes between this proposition and the object as it is in itself. In essence, consciousness allows for the possibility that this proposition is false. So this might seem true, except at the very beginning it doesn't do this. So sense certainty has no such belief or criterion, for it believes it has no position of its own, that it merely receives the object immediately in its senses, and refers to that object just as immediately in its signs or pointing. Only in the second form of consciousness, perception, does error consciously arise as a necessity from the impossibility of unmediated reference to the thing. And it's not even the mediation that causes the error, it's the fact that there is the discrepancy in the assumption of the distinction of thought and being. Continuing, these then have two implications. 3, because consciousness itself makes a distinction between its claim and the object it is about. The object cannot be truly in itself, but must be for consciousness. This means that consciousness must have a concept of its object in order to individuate it. 4, however, consciousness cannot be aware that the object is for it without ceasing to be consciousness, and thus must suppress this fact. This means that consciousness cannot recognize that the concept of the object is dependent upon it without undermining the possibility of falsity. So my response to that is not quite. See the understanding which thoroughly believes the object to be an unconditioned universal thought, yet recognizes falsity in the unintelligibility of the dialectic of its thought. In self-consciousness, the utter dependency of the world to the self is already assumed, yet falsification still arises, not because of a belief in other objects, but because the object as thought contradicts itself. So when he says this means that consciousness cannot recognize that the concept of the object is dependent upon it without undermining the possibility of falsity. So by the third chapter, this is not true, because it's already assumed that actually the objects are totally dependent upon consciousness, and yet falsity still happens. Both because falsity does not just refer to your beliefs, but it also refers to ontological processes in which being denies one's belief, but also because there are beliefs or concepts, in this case properly speaking, that will be contradictory, and the understanding does not recognize contradiction as valid. So this describes the form of intentional thought in which we think about particular objects using fixed propositions composed of pre-individuated concepts, as opposed to science as the form of non-intentional thought in which we think the content of concepts directly. This not only describes the deductive procedure that we follow in ordinary discourse, but it equally determines the specific dialectical method of the phenomenology. The phenomenology proceeds by a method of exhaustion. It does this by showing that each possible form of natural consciousness ultimately contradicts itself, thereby transforming itself into another possible form until we have exhausted all possible forms. It thus demonstrates that if knowledge is conceived as natural consciousness, then it is impossible. This progressive exhaustion of possibilities is stratified in much the way that the dialectic of the logic is stratified. As before, I will distinguish between at least 4 separate levels. The basic dialectic. This is a phenomenology viewed as a serial progression of various things consciousness purports to know about its object. This is a series of propositions. No, it's not, or I told you. It's concepts, each of which produces the next by contradicting itself. There is a series of such propositions within each form of consciousness, beginning with a sequence in sense certainty. This is here and now, this is here and now, for me, etc., and ending in the identity thesis. The division of forms. This is the separation of sequences of purported knowings into forms of consciousness, such as sense certainty, perception, understanding, self-consciousness, etc., and ending in absolute knowing. Each of these corresponds to a general way of understanding its object that each purported knowing shares, or a concept of the object, as described in point 3. The division of sections. This is the organization of sequences of forms of consciousness into more general categories, such as consciousness, self-consciousness, and reason. Each of these corresponds to a more general concept of its object, to which its subforms correspond as species. The overall dialectic. This is the phenomenology viewed as the justification of the logic, or the transformation of the concept of natural consciousness into the concept of science. So the issue with saying that the phenomenology's justification for the logic is that, well, by Hegel's own view, the phenomenology is let's say it's a thing that destroys itself by its self-jamming. So if a thing destroys itself by its self-jamming, is this really a justification for the arising of what does not jam itself, since the jammed is no longer present to hold back the unjammed? I mean, are you really constructing an engine when there's a bad piece that wasn't supposed to be there, and you take it out, and then the engine works? I don't think so. I mean, you could say you're repairing it, right? You're fixing it, but you're not fixing the engine as engine, because the problem was not the engine as engine. The problem is that there was something in the engine that was not supposed to be there because it's not part of the engine's design.
Can you send a PDF in the side chat?
Yeah. Wolfendale. With my comments and everything. So continuing, this structure lets us see the way in which the phenomenology is still a dialectic, albeit one that consists in propositions that are purportedly absolute, rather than speculative propositions that are explicitly transitional. Each form of consciousness is a concept whose content is thought imminently by the method of exhaustion. These form a hierarchy of genus and species that correspond to the various higher level ways of dividing the dialectic. The concept of natural consciousness is the highest genus, with each level beneath it divided into mutually exclusive species. The thing is, that's not really true, because natural consciousness does not have a true concept. It's a wrong assumption. It's a false assumption. So it's not really a genus, and its species are not really natural species to it. I mean, pay attention, look up for yourself at what I'm talking about. The beginning of each form of consciousness involves the sudden positing of problems that are not there in the originating concept that you transition from. So in sense certainty, we just have the immediate positing. There's a division. Then there's shown to be a problem between the claim of knowledge and the object, both in experience and in the linguistic, epistemic access. And then you begin perception. And perception begins with the minimal determinacy of a universal that is also sensuous, that is perception, which also involves determinacy as a multiplicity within one. It is then randomly posited arbitrarily by that form of consciousness that these are properties, that there is a unifying substrate, that the connection is a negative unity, the one, and that this connection is not inherent or internal to the substrate, the substance, or the properties, and therefore they are together only as what Hegel calls the also. None of those are actually natural determinations of that first beginning concept of a simple, sensuous universal that is determinate. Those are completely arbitrary. So you cannot say that this is a genuine concept in which there is actually a genus and there are actually species. That doesn't work at all. What do you think about that, Rain? I mean, like, am I right on that? Because I mean, like, that just seems concocted. Like, see, the dialectical method of exhaustion. That's right, God.
Yeah, I don't find his genus species hierarchy division very helpful. I don't know. It feels like he's just going through the index and he's just saying this contains the next, contains the next.
Yeah, I mean, like, you can't really apply it to it because it's not a genuine concept. So, see, the dialectical method of exhaustion thus consists in traversing the hierarchy in a double movement. One moves between the genera within a given level by unpacking their internal contradictions, and one does this by exhausting all of their species in a similar manner. The inferences between propositions at the lowest level thus imminently constitutes movement between concepts at the higher level. What this means is that the phenomenology is a logic of consciousness first, a teleological history of consciousness second, and that is at no point anything like an introspective psychology. Yep. So where does Hegel go wrong? Here's the meat. Hegel's great mistake is to be found in the way in which he sets up the argument of the phenomenology, rather than in any particular part of the dialectics of the phenomenology and the logic. It consists in the fact that his response to the problem of transcendental method is fundamentally inadequate. To understand this, it's necessary to see how it is that Hegel's concept of natural consciousness is supposed to improve upon the Pyrrhonian skeptic's minimal description of the structure of justification. All the Pyrrhonian skeptic needs in order to articulate the Agrippin trilemma is an account of assertions, the propositions these assertions express, the relations of incompatibility between these propositions, and the relations of consequence that enable them to justify each other. Again, propositions aren't like the basis of any of the arguments in the phenomenology. Hegel's response to this is essentially that it is insufficient to capture the appearance of knowledge. And I don't agree with that. No, Hegel's response is that it presumes too much. The skeptic is not skeptical enough since they are providing their own ready-made criterion as if they already possess transcendental knowledge of the form knowledge must take, which is precisely the problem. The skeptic doesn't have a proof of this. So his concept of natural consciousness replaces this with an analysis of internal structures of propositions. Again, I don't know why he mentions propositions. In terms of objects and concepts. The rest of the Pyrrhonian model is implicit within this simple structure, insofar as it follows from the interactions between the possibility of falsity and the conceptual suppression. And again, it's not quite true. So no, while one can externally project this form, it is there, the skeptical form. It is not Hegel's point. He does not bring up any of the skeptical forms to judge why a form of consciousness fails. Each form fails according to its own concept of the object not achieving what they originally claim it achieves. Indeed, one can look at the first three sections of the dialectics, uncertainty, perception, and understanding, as making these features explicit: subject, predicate, structure, incompatibility, relations between predicates, and the consequence relations, respectively. So again, one can project this, but it is not the immanent structure Hegel is explicating in any of them. For example, consequence relations are not actually a major factor in force and law. The major factor there is a distinction in general collapse, regardless of being a condition or grounding or a simple assertion of difference and identity. So the skeptical forms are never really the centerpiece. Hegel's problem is that it is possible to level the charge of insufficiency that he directs at Pyrrhonian skepticism against his own account of the appearance of consciousness. And, well, the problem is that Hegel has no account of the appearance of consciousness. That's why it's an appearance. It's just there. Like, all that Hegel does methodically is to just order it from simplest to most complex, and that's just simply it's an unjustified position to do, but it's also just, everybody just assumes that's the way you do things, right? You go from simple to complex. You don't go from complex to simple. If you're going to try to disprove something, trying to disprove its complexity backwards is just doing it the hard way. I mean, if the simple form can be disproven, then the whole complex form was also disproven. So it's much easier, pragmatically, to go from the simple to the complex. So we are thus faced with a renewed form of the problem of the criterion, namely, how do we choose between competing accounts of the appearance of knowledge or accounts of the ordinary structure of justification? So problems with this are that, one, Hegel does not set out by saying that we do or we can do such a thing at the outset. Two, the method of exhaustion takes every form as absolute and checks it against itself. If a position works, wonderful. The problem of competing criterions can only arise if one has proven that multiple positions work. 3. The problem of the transcendental criterion will bring both positions into relation, which will reveal a categorical distinction where they are separated or united, or in which, what is certainly the case, both, and so contradicted as independent and dependent. 4. This contradiction is already apparent within every form of consciousness, where we see each form traverse at least two subforms. Therefore, we have already experienced the multi-layered criterion problem from the beginning. So, two issues he raises up there. One is Hegel needs to justify the appearance of knowledge. Well, no, an appearance just is an appearance. That's why it's an appearance. Of course, when knowledge first appears, we don't know if it's real knowledge, true knowledge, or some kind of fake knowledge. It calls itself knowledge, we'll take it, So there's no problem there about how does knowledge appear? Well, it does. You wouldn't know it. You wouldn't not know it either. So, something claims to be knowledge. There you go. And then the second problem of, then how do we tell, between these forms of natural consciousness? And as I already outlined, from the very beginning, you don't assume that you have to tell anything about them. You're not comparing anything at the beginning. You're not going I got 10 different forms of consciousness right here claiming knowledge. God, which one do I choose? Which one is the true one? You just sort them out. Okay, we'll go from simplest to most complex. Let's see which one works. You don't get the criterion problem unless multiple ones work, which they never do. And even if multiple ones worked, then you would have the issue of the contradiction of their distinction and unity together, which would then give you the transcendental form of knowledge that knows them, which would basically be give you absolute knowing, ultimately, if you had all the forms. And even if you don't assume absolute knowing, and you don't assume that you ought to be doing this, nonetheless you're doing this. So within each form of consciousness, there are multiple changes in the criterion. So there's no problem. In essence, even if Hegel does not presuppose that knowledge is possible, which he doesn't, he doesn't care about possibility of knowledge, he does not have an account of what it would be for an account of the appearance of knowledge to be sufficient. Well, he doesn't need to. At the beginning, you can't have it because you don't know what knowledge is. You're looking at people claiming to have knowledge, and you're just going, okay, is this consistent? Is it not? But at the end, yes, you do have an account of what would be sufficient. What would be sufficient is something that does not suffer the opposition of consciousness. Why? Because you've shown that the opposition of consciousness just doesn't work. It self-destructs. And we know why it self-destructs, just on a universal level. So whether one agrees that Hegel succeeds or not, the fact is he does have an account of the as the self-certainty of knowing that knows itself as a knowing of knowing, aka absolute knowing. This is perfectly consistent with the idea that Hegel's concept of natural consciousness describes necessary features of the structure of knowledge. We simply need a deductive procedure that is capable of deriving it and whatever other features of the structure of knowledge are necessary. This is just to ask after the proper method of transcendental philosophy. And again, I don't know why he thinks that we need a deductive procedure on top of the procedure. That it's just stupid in my view. Like, if the procedure already moves on its own without any need to appeal to it, like, why would you add this second layer? So I thus think that Hegel's failure to justify the logic is the greatest mistake in the history of philosophy for two reasons. On the one hand, it demonstrates that if we are to deal with the problem of skepticism, we must become transcendental philosophers, which the answer is no. Hegel already refutes transcendentalism. This is to say that it demonstrates the necessity of transcendental philosophy. On the other hand, it lets us clearly pose the problem of transcendental method, or the question of what transcendental philosophy is. How do we imminently describe the structure of ordinary discourse? And Hegel's solution is by letting it tell you and taking it naively for what it is at first. And you can see here, like, he's flipped the tables. So, whereas the usual question is, like, what is transcendental to ordinary discourse? He's making ordinary discourse, the measure of, well, you'll see. There are a number of further things that can be said about this more determinate formulation of the problem of transcendental method. It would be correct to point out that it is very close to Hegel's own project, insofar as Hegel takes the logic to completely explicate the conceptual structure of all forms of thought, including the ordinary form of thought found in natural consciousness. However, it would be an error to think that it is just restating Hegel's own problem, because Hegel takes the form of thought through which the structure of the ordinary form is deduced, science, to be completely opposed to this ordinary form, natural consciousness. That's not true. Science is not opposed to phenomenology at all. Like, the fact is that science arises out of phenomenology, because phenomenology is nothing but the immediate form of science. For consciousness, which has the presupposition of the opposition of consciousness. The reason why is justified, quote unquote, the justification of the opposition of consciousness has everything to do with just natural being. We are natural beings. We have an actual difference between what is within our minds and what is out there in the world. We have the experience of the misalignment between what we believe and what happens out there objectively. So this assumption is natural to the way we actually experience the world. So it's not just some like assumption out of nowhere. It's not just a completely arbitrary error. It's based on our own animal being and how we come out of that animal being. But that being the case, when we think truly, even on the assumptions of our own animal existence, if we are true in thinking, we must produce the concept of science out of this phenomena. Like, there is no way that we could not. So, science is not opposed to natural consciousness phenomenology. For him, science and natural consciousness are mutually exclusive species of the genus of thought. That's not true. Which is only properly explicated by the logic. So again, this genus-species distinction, he's making it, Hegel doesn't make it. Hegel never says that this is the case. And it's not just that he doesn't say it. Like, according to the conception of the whole thing, it doesn't make any sense to say such a thing. By contrast, my approach takes ordinary thought, natural consciousness, or discourse to be the genus, and the special form of thought that explicates it to be a species of it. And my comment on this is, well, this is literally nonsense. The procedure of the failure of self-explication and self-confirmation of natural consciousness is what reveals it as a failure according to itself. And in this acknowledgement reveals that a higher form of reason underlies this very acknowledgement. So, I don't see how Wolfendale can believe, think. I can see how he can believe it. I can't see how he can think that you can reverse this. It's not possible. It just isn't. One of these buckles under its own execution and one of these doesn't. How could you say that the one that buckles is the one that is actually the transcendental genus of the one that doesn't? That makes absolutely no sense. Any thoughts on that, Rain?
Nothing in particular at the moment.
All right. That's basically the end of the argument. That final piece, he just kind of reiterates it again. Just says it's... we can see that not only does the inadequate justification of the constant natural consciousness, the phenomenology, undermine the justification of the logic as such, which is not true, because it's not a justification at all. But it brings into question the method of the phenomenology itself, insofar as the latter is already implicitly dialectical in a way that is neither explicated nor justified until the logic. This whole idea that, this needs any justification is just ridiculous, because it doesn't. All it is just pure thought. Just think within the abstractions. Why do you need to justify that? So, one, natural consciousness requires no justification to posit itself as simply present and ready to engage with apparent criteria. Two, the dialectical methodology has no need to be explicated in appearance. It is just thought naturally carried out in its pure form wherever into whatever one applies it to. If one had issues with the methodology, one would have to give grounds for why. What is the problem with the dialectical exposition of the immanence of thought? What is it missing? Because he says, there's a problem with it. The problem is it's not justified. But what is the actual problem? Where's the details on that? Nowhere. You could go and say, there's a problem of a deduction. Okay, well, then you would have to just show where does the deduction go wrong. But he said that's not the problem. So why do you need to justify it? Especially when the whole thing is a phenomenology. Of course, if you're not satisfied by the proof and you think that there's other proofs, by all means, go look for other proofs. Good luck with that. So let's see. So this reintroduces an element of viciousness into the circle that Hegel's philosophy traces. Transcendental philosophy can avoid this residual viciousness while retaining only the virtuous elements of Hegel's explicative approach. It can do this because, given that transcendental discourse is a species of discourse in general, the immanent deduction of the structure of discourse will at the same time be a description of the general structure of this deduction itself. The two challenges for this approach are to show that the genus of discourse immanently differentiates itself into various species, including transcendental discourse, and to find an explanatory primitive that cannot be rejected in order to foreclose its method to justificatory regress and circularity. Its virtuous circle would then consist in explicating the implicit content of this primitive, and on this basis explicating its own method explication. Well, gee, we already have a guy who did this, named Hegel, except he didn't have this other requirement of an explanatory primitive that cannot be rejected. Because, I mean, as far as Hegel goes, he doesn't care about rejection or acceptance. This whole thing is like what is actually required for thought. Whether you accept it or not, that's your business. You can be wrong. No one can stop you from being wrong. To conclude, it's interesting to look at the structure of my argument in terms that Hegel himself would find familiar, as a dialectical triad of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. He knows that he did this on purpose. He knows that he's going to annoy people greatly. Transcendental philosophy in its original form is here the thesis. It is a systematic attempt to respond to the problems of skepticism which, as Hegel points out, is vitiated by a peculiar kind of regress. Hegel's development of absolute idealism out of his criticism is then the antithesis of this original synthesis. The oppositional character of the two can be seen in the opposition of natural consciousness and science. My criticisms of Hegel's positions then pave way for a synthesis of these two positions, which is not a return to naive transcendentalism or the standpoint of the abstract understanding and distinction from reason, but rather an attempt to reincorporate the truth in Hegel's ideas within a more adequate framework. I mean, you can say this, and this is just like saying, well, I'm doing Hegel, but I'm doing something different than Hegel. But all you're doing is either just worse, wrong, or you're saying you're doing something different, but you're actually not doing anything different. You know, it's like somebody who could say, like, well, how come the logic ends with the idea, huh? Like, well, what if I posit there's a super idea? Well, is the structure of the super idea actually any different than the idea? They would have to show that. They would have to show that this is actually an intelligible relationship, which is not just another verbal delusion. Like, for example, in Force and Understanding, these Phenomenology Spirit, there are like 5 moves which are nothing but linguistic rearticulations that are actually not conceptually distinct. So you change the names of things, you rearrange their order, and you say that it's different, but actually they're not different at all. And so that's what I see him doing here. Like he's saying this is different. He's changing the names. He's coining this term, this new higher transcendental philosophy. But that's all he's done. He's just changed the names, shifted the things around, and claimed that it's something different when it's actually not different at all. And in fact, it's actually worse. And this was preliminary. I mean, he published this back in like 2012. And it seems he hasn't really gone any further in really cashing out what the hell this is. Anyways, that's that. Anybody got comments on that in general? Questions on that in general? All right, nope. Very well. All right, for those of you who watch it on YouTube, hopefully you were entertained. If you want to, go ahead and send this to Wolfendale. I doubt he'll care.